The words hit like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus of progressive politics. When Bernie Sanders, the man who had inspired a generation of young revolutionaries, the politician who had made political revolution a household phrase, looked directly at Zohran Mamdani and declared his approach reckless, it wasn't just criticism. It was excommunication from the progressive movement's holy church. The 82-year-old senator from Vermont had built his entire career on challenging the establishment, on speaking truth to power, on refusing to compromise with a corrupt system. But on this cold February morning, he was the one wielding institutional power against a young revolutionary who had dared to out-Bernie himself. And what happened next would prove that in progressive politics, even revolutionaries have their limits. The confrontation had been building for months, simmering beneath the surface of what appeared to be a unified progressive front. Behind closed doors, Bernie's inner circle had been growing increasingly alarmed by Mamdani's escalating rhetoric and his apparent determination to push progressive politics beyond the boundaries that even Sanders considered acceptable. The Vermont senator, who had spent decades carefully building the progressive infrastructure that made candidates like Mamdani possible, was watching his life's work being threatened by someone who claimed to be his ideological heir. The breaking point came during what was supposed to be a routine endorsement meeting at Bernie's Burlington home on February 15th. Mamdani had flown to Vermont expecting a friendly conversation with his political hero, perhaps some sage advice about navigating the challenges of progressive governance. Instead, he walked into an intervention that had been carefully orchestrated by the most powerful figures in progressive politics. Sitting around Bernie's kitchen table, the same table where he had planned his presidential campaigns, were the people who had built the modern progressive movement from the ground up. Jane Sanders, Bernie's wife and closest political advisor; Faiz Shakir, former campaign manager who now ran Bernie's political operation; Nina Turner, the fiery Ohio politician who had become Bernie's most trusted surrogate; Jeff Weaver, the political strategist who had guided Bernie through 2 presidential campaigns; Zohran. Bernie had begun, his voice carrying the weight of decades of political battles. "We need to talk." What followed was a 3-hour session that would later be described by participants as the most intense political intervention in modern progressive history. According to multiple sources who were present, Bernie methodically dismantled every aspect of Mamdani's political approach, from his confrontational rhetoric to his tactical decisions to his fundamental understanding of how progressive change actually happens in America. "You think you're being revolutionary," Bernie reportedly told Mamdani, his voice rising with the passion that had made him famous. "But revolution isn't about making the loudest noise or picking the biggest fights. Revolution is about building power systematically, sustainably, in ways that actually improve people's lives. What you're doing isn't revolution, it's performance art." The criticism stung because it came from someone Mamdani had idolized since his college days. Bernie Sanders wasn't just another politician criticizing his approach. He was the man who had taught Mamdani that politics could be about more than incremental change, that it was possible to challenge the fundamental structures of American capitalism. To be told by his political hero that he was failing to live up to progressive principles was devastating. But Bernie wasn't finished. According to sources, he pulled out a thick folder containing polling data, media analysis, and strategic assessments that painted a damning picture of Mamdani's impact on progressive politics nationwide. The data showed that Mamdani's confrontational approach was hurting progressive candidates across the country, that his rhetoric was being used by Republicans to attack Democrats in swing districts, that his very existence as a progressive leader was making it harder for other progressives to win elections. "Look at these numbers," Bernie had reportedly said, spreading the documents across his kitchen table. "Every time you make headlines with some inflammatory statement, our candidates in Ohio lose 2 points. When you attack other Democrats, Republicans in Texas use your words in their campaign ads. You're not building the movement, you're destroying it from within." The most devastating moment came when Bernie showed Mamdani internal polling from progressive organizations that revealed a harsh truth. Even among committed progressive activists, Mamdani's approval ratings were dropping. The very base that should have been his strongest supporters was beginning to question whether his approach was helping or hurting their shared goals. 63% of our revolution members think you're hurting progressive causes, Nina Turner had added, her voice heavy with disappointment. "These are people who knocked doors for me in Ohio, who phone banked for Bernie's campaigns, who believe in everything we're fighting for, and even they think you've gone too far." The intervention reached its climax when Bernie delivered what sources described as the most pointed political lecture of his career. For 20 minutes, the man who had spent his life fighting the establishment explained to Mamdani why his approach was not just wrong, but dangerous to everything progressives had worked to build. "You want to know what revolution looks like?" Bernie had reportedly said, his voice taking on the cadence that had filled stadiums across America. "Revolution is what we've accomplished over the past decade. We moved the Democratic Party from defending the status quo to talking about Medicare for all. We made the Green New Deal mainstream policy. We got Joe Biden to embrace the most progressive platform in Democratic history. That's how you build revolution, not by throwing tantrums when people disagree with you." The meeting ended with Bernie delivering the ultimatum that would soon become public knowledge. Either Mamdani would moderate his approach and work within the progressive coalition, or he would find himself politically isolated. "I've spent 40 years building this movement," Bernie had concluded. "I'm not going to let you tear it down in 40 months. Mamdani's response, according to participants, was defiant but clearly shaken. He argued that Bernie had become too comfortable with incremental change, that the climate crisis and economic inequality demanded more radical action than the progressive establishment was willing to consider. But his arguments fell flat in the face of Bernie's systematic dismantling of his political approach. The public revelation of this private confrontation came 3 days later during Bernie's appearance on Meet the Press. When Chuck Todd asked about reports of tension between Sanders and Mamdani, Bernie delivered the soundbite that would define the rest of Mamdani's political career. "Look, I respect the passion that Mayor Mamdani brings to these issues," Bernie said, choosing his words carefully. "But passion without strategy isn't progressive politics, it's just noise. And frankly, some of what I'm seeing from New York isn't revolution, it's recklessness. And recklessness doesn't help working families pay their bills or get healthcare or find affordable housing." The word recklessness landed like a political neutron bomb. Coming from Bernie Sanders, it carried devastating implications. If the man who had inspired the progressive movement thought Mamdani was reckless, then every other progressive leader felt licensed to distance themselves from the New York mayor. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic for Mamdani's political standing. Within hours of Bernie's Meet the Press appearance, progressive organizations began distancing themselves from Mamdani's approach. Our Revolution quietly removed Mamdani from their endorsement list. Justice Democrats emphasized their commitment to strategic progressive politics. But perhaps the most devastating reaction came from the progressive grassroots themselves. Social media, which had been Mamdani's strongest platform, turned against him with shocking speed. Progressive activists who had once celebrated his confrontational approach began sharing Bernie's recklessness comment with their own critiques of Mamdani's strategy. #RecklessNotRevolutionary began trending on Twitter, with thousands of progressive voters expressing their agreement with Bernie's assessment. The hashtag was particularly damaging because it came from Mamdani's own supposed base. These weren't moderate Democrats or Republicans. Attacking him, these were committed progressive activists who believed in Medicare for all and the Green New Deal. And they were concluding that Mamdani's approach was counterproductive to their shared goals. Conservative media, meanwhile, was having a field day with the progressive civil war. Fox News ran Bernie's recklessness comment on loop, with commentators gleefully noting that even the socialist wing of the Democratic Party thought Mamdani had gone too far. But the most damaging coverage came from mainstream Democratic sources who felt vindicated by Bernie's intervention. CNN featured panels arguing that Bernie's criticism proved progressives were capable of policing their own movement. Behind the scenes, the progressive political infrastructure that had taken decades to build was rapidly closing ranks against Mamdani. Progressive donor networks began redirecting their contributions to other candidates. Labor unions started distancing themselves from his governance approach. Most significantly, the pipeline of progressive talent began drying up as ambitious staffers chose to associate themselves with other politicians. The isolation was so complete that when Mamdani attempted to respond to Bernie's criticism during a February 20th press conference, he found himself without the usual progressive surrogates who might have defended him. No squad members appeared alongside him. No progressive organization leaders offered their support. Mamdani's response, when it came, was politically catastrophic. Rather than acknowledging Bernie's concerns or attempting to find common ground with the progressive movement he was being exiled from, he chose to escalate the conflict in the most destructive way possible. "I have tremendous respect for Senator Sanders and everything he's accomplished," Mamdani began, standing alone at a podium in City Hall. But if he thinks the approach that couldn't win a Democratic primary is going to solve the climate crisis and economic inequality, then maybe it's time for new leadership in the progressive movement. The attack on Bernie's electoral record was a stunning miscalculation. Sanders had run two of the most successful progressive presidential campaigns in American history, fundamentally reshaping Democratic politics and inspiring millions of young activists. To suggest that his approach was a failure was not just politically tone-deaf, it was an insult to every progressive activist who had phone-banked, canvassed, and donated to Bernie's campaigns. The backlash was swift and overwhelming. Within an hour of Mamdani's press conference, every major progressive figure in American politics had issued statements supporting Bernie and criticizing Mamdani. AOC, who had already distanced herself from Mamdani, tweeted, "Bernie Sanders taught us that revolution requires both passion and wisdom. Attacking the teacher doesn't make you the successor." Elizabeth Warren added, "Senator Sanders has spent decades building the progressive movement that makes all our work possible. We honor that legacy through effective action, not inflammatory rhetoric." Even more devastating was the response from Bernie's army of grassroots supporters. The phone bank volunteers who had made millions of calls for Bernie's campaigns, the small dollar donors who had funded his political revolution, the young activists who had been inspired by his message, they all turned against Mamdani with a fury that demonstrated just how much political capital he had burned. Bernie's own response was characteristically measured but politically lethal. In a statement released that evening, he said simply, "I'm focused on fighting for working families, not engaging in personal attacks from politicians who seem more interested in making headlines than making progress." The dignity of Bernie's response, contrasted with Mamdani's desperate attack, crystallized everything that was wrong with the young mayor's political approach. Here was Bernie Sanders, at 82 years old, taking the high road while the politician who claimed to represent the future of progressive politics was reduced to personal attacks and deflection. The final nail in Mamdani's progressive coffin came from an unexpected source, his own political hero worship of Bernie. In college, Mamdani had written extensively about Sanders as the model for progressive leadership. His senior thesis had been titled The Sanders Model, Building Progressive Power Through Authentic Politics. Now, progressive researchers were digging up these old writings and using them to highlight the contradiction between Mamdani's stated beliefs and his current behavior. How could someone who had written admiringly about Bernie's strategic approach now be attacking the very methods he had once praised? The cognitive dissonance was too much for even Mamdani's most loyal supporters to ignore. Within a week of his attack on Bernie, 3 of his deputy mayors resigned. His communications director, press secretary, and chief of staff all announced they were stepping down. The progressive political operation was collapsing under the weight of its leaders' political isolation. By the end of February, just 2 weeks after Bernie's recklessness comment, Mamdani had gone from rising progressive star to political pariah faster than any major political figure in recent memory. He had managed to alienate not just his ideological opponents, but his natural allies, his supposed mentors, and even his own staff. The lesson was brutal but unmistakable. In progressive politics, Bernie Sanders wasn't just another politician, he was the movement's founding father, its moral authority, its North Star. To attack Bernie wasn't just to disagree with a fellow progressive, it was to attack the very foundations of the movement itself. And when Bernie Sanders says you're being reckless rather than revolutionary, every other progressive in America listens. Because if you can't convince the man who launched the political revolution that you're helping rather than hurting the cause, then maybe the problem isn't with the movement, maybe the problem is with you. Mamdani had learned, too late, that there's a difference between inheriting a political revolution and earning the right to lead one. And in trying to surpass his political hero, he had instead demonstrated exactly why Bernie Sanders remained the only politician in America who could make or break a progressive career with a single word: recklessness.